The brief for the tool, it was designed to help funders and operators of residential care facilities to consider those cost implications of transition and then to generate the estimates that they can use, in particular, to really help them with decision making and planning, which is so vitally important. And people can so easily get stuck in the process of decision as they're working through what the cost implications are and trying to just figure out how to estimate what is headed their way through a transition as they move through those phases. And as well, that vitally important step of securing a commitment from all the stakeholders involved, because we know that without everyone's buy-in, things can not progress very, very quickly or very slowly, as you might say. We designed the tool with two sorts of users in mind. The primary users we designed it for was those who are actually managing and implementing transition in the homes. And we know that those people have a limited experience with transition, and that the boards and management who they're part of also have limited experience. So we wanted to develop a tool that they could utilize and work with that didn't require them to be experts in this particular field. But we also know that they don't journey alone. They work with the secondary users of the tools. And I recognize a number of the names in the chat here: technical support and advisory partners, those who walk the journey alongside those who are running residential care facilities and who are working through the process of how to transition. And so we also had in mind that we wanted the tool to be useful for you guys as well. Now, we know that you might prefer a bit more detail in the tool than we've provided, but let me tell you, the tool has sufficient information for those primary users, and you secondary users, and I put myself in that same category. We have other tools that we can draw from. And so this isn't a solution for everything. As Beck said, it's one of 3 tools and many other resources that are available. So it's meant to be used in conjunction with all those elements. My experience working with ACCI, I definitely count myself amongst those secondary users, the advisory partners walking alongside. But at the same time, because we work with a number of smaller NGOs and charities and residential care facilities, many times I found myself drawn in as a primary user, working very closely alongside management and board as they were grappling with the decisions that they need to make. And many of those boil down to how do we make the budgets work? How do we work through these finances? Where are we going to get the funding that we need? So I feel like I've got very much first-hand experience of a primary user as well, though I would have preferred not to have joined some of those boards along the journey. Decision-making, as I said, it's a key theme in the development of this tool, how it can assist with processing the decisions that need to be made when it comes to transitions. And it's complicated. There's multiple stakeholders with competing objectives, and rarely does the information all lay with one single person. It needs to be sourced from different areas. And then there's the spike costs and where we source the funding for those. And then it just can be very difficult to estimate that, which is why we've come up with this tool. The spike cost. This is one of the fundamental challenges that we face. As we move through the phases of transition, our baseline budgets continue with business as usual. Meanwhile, we begin incurring these extra costs that spike our budget at certain key points along the journey. Whether that's instituting gatekeeping activities, hiring social workers, training staff, these are going to spike our budgets. We can't just reduce our budget down to the available funds. We need to work out how we're going to fund those spike costs. So the problems we're trying to solve with this tool is to have a simplified framework that focuses on the key elements that are relevant to most transitions and that give you the relevant information for those key decisions. And that also provides a framework for users in estimating those spike costs. and which also can give them a realistic picture of when the cost savings might start to kick in, because certainly one of the conversations around transition is when can I start to shift some of the costs away from running the residential care facility into some of these other activities that we're looking at doing. And of course, timing is key. The costs are going to spike on one end and the savings are not going to kick in as soon as we would like. So we aim to create a simple post-transition picture as well that gives us some image of what it looks like at the end of all of this process, that we can go, that's where we're headed to. So how we built the tool is very much thanks to a number of people who contributed to a very long survey that we put out that provided us data that we could analyze and work through. It had a variety of general information on staffing, size, location, salary costs, currency differences. We collected annual pre-transition budgets, the baseline before any of the spike costs were incurred. And we also asked for comparative annual budget when they were at the 50% reintegration point to compare, once again, looking for those cost reductions that were starting to kick in. And then we asked for a post-transition annual budget at the 100% reintegration point. So we started to map out some of those trends in the costs. We also surveyed them on a range of the spike costs. We collected both financial information as well as narrative responses. We looked at the various aspects of transition, case management, training, aftercare, accessing specialized services. And then we looked for what were the key cost drivers that underpinned the spike costs and that kept coming up time and time again through the transition. And then we took these elements and we created an interactive model based on this analysis. The approach is that we can provide a starting point that provides a baseline model that captures some of those unknown elements within the model that users may not know, may not be aware of, yet they're not held up while they're trying to search for these great unknowns. We then had a model that can be adjusted based on your specific circumstances, what you do know, the biggest known being your current baseline budget. So that gives us a starting point to launch off on. And we wanted to keep it simple by giving you only access to as variables to those key drivers of cost through this process, so that you can start to play around with some of the assumptions that you're working with, and at the end of it, come out with a what if scenario. If we approach our transition this way, what could it look like? And it also then documents all those choices that you make along the pathway, so that you have something that you can come back and reflect on. Because we know that these are estimates, these are forecasts. You're looking ahead in order to make decisions now, but you can also reflect along the journey through the phases of transition. Is this playing out the way we intended? If not, where, why, how, and look at how we can make adjustments to the journey. So now let's run through the bit of a walkthrough of the cost estimation tool. It lives on the BCN website, so you can navigate it through there using the link. We've got tick boxes and we've got info screens throughout the journey so that you can access some additional information. First time you work through the tool, you're probably just playing around with the elements, getting a feel for how it works, reading the dialog boxes. As you go along, you can tick and close down those, and it becomes easier to navigate through. We've built it around 5 steps, and the first step is looking at the baseline data. So what we found from looking at your data and what we know about how the costs of a residential care facility work is that the costs can't really be tracked and they don't really get driven per child, but they move up by bands or ranges. And so what we've done is we've built in the model underneath 5 different ranges of size. So you can see here we've selected 35 children, which puts us in the 20 to 50 children range. If I change that to 19, you can see we drop down into the less than 20 children. If I pop you up to 60, we move up into the next bracket. So this is a variable that you can play with, and it draws from the underlying data that is built into these bands. When we think about it, we know this is true, because if we add one child into a facility where we've got surplus beds, there's only a small incremental cost. But if we add children into a home where there's insufficient beds, what's that going to mean? It means a new building. It means additional staff hires. It means additional overheads, utilities, electricity, water. And so the costs move up in these logical bands. And so we identified what were some ranges that could be worked with, and there's underlying data that's built on that. So that's the primary cost driver that we identified, the ranges. We second identified three different options, and we turned them into tick boxes. Do you rent your facility, or is it provided for you? Maybe you own it, maybe it's provided at no cost through a relationship such as a church or a movement or something along those lines. And you can tick to make those active, or untick to make them inactive. There's also other costs that aren't directly attributed to running a residential care facility, but which many people would have in their budgets. They may already be involved in providing aftercare services separate to the children in the residential care facility. They may already have programs, operating within the community. And so we want to pull them out so that we can start comparing apples and apples. So you'll notice that there's a big red button here. And when we press that, the tool will be pre-populated with the data that we've drawn from this particular range. If you make a change anywhere, that big red box will reappear, and it will be important to repress the button. So after you've had a bit of a play with the tool and you're ready to start putting in your own data, my advice is to make sure you just get these 1.1, 1.2 correct before you press the button. That way you're not going, oh, what happened to my information? Why has it disappeared? Well, it got overwritten by the default information in the model. Next, we move to 1.3, and there's another fork in the road, and that is which pathway of type of transition are you pursuing? Are you transitioning into some other form of non-residential care services, or are you proceeding to a safe closure, reintegration, and shutting down the facility? So we have a simple radio button, A or B for that one. And now we get to 1.4, which is the baseline costs. So at this stage, it contains the information from that particular cost range, and we pulled the averages from the people who had submitted surveys. Now we've broken it down into some particular categories, and everyone operates their financial reports differently, and they've got different headers, but we've chosen these ones strategically because we could see certain trends operating with these elements of information. And we wanted to break down the staffing into the different components, because as you move through transition, we know that you need more of the social work and the skilled workers and less of the caregivers and the unskilled workers. So the model allows for the movement in those costs in the underlying data, as well as the way that you can engage with it in some of the spike cost variables. If at any time you can press the button and reset this information. Now you can see that this gives us a budget of 237. So this is where you want to pull out your own cost budget, your own annual budget of your facility and start to fill in the gaps. And if you're having trouble working out what goes where, there's a link to an Excel worksheet that you can click on, and that will open up. So in the bold, we've got those main headers, and underneath them, the types of costs that we've aggregated in the data and that you could aggregate as well. Even though I'm an accountant, I'm saying don't get too hung up on the really fine detail here. We are creating estimates so that we can make decisions, so that we can move this process forward in a timely manner. So just see how you go, and don't get too hung up on the detail. One detail you do want to pay attention to is that the annual budget at the end of it should match what your figure is. So let me say that our budget was 200,000. So I would want to make sure that the figure I had there was somewhat reflective of that. Once you've played around with that data and you've got it about right, you have now substituted your own data for the baseline data in the model. And so we can start moving forward based on that. One of the questions I do get asked is, should I be worried that we're just playing around with estimates when we're making all of these very important decisions? And the truth is that we make perfectly good decisions every day based on imperfect information. And this is just another example of it. We're just making some estimates that we're going to help us move forward with the process. And this is a tool that will work alongside all the other valuable detailed work that people are involved in. But when it comes to sitting down with boards and key decision makers, this can be a valuable simplified picture that can help everyone see whether they're on the same page and serve to let you know what assumptions you've built into the process along the way. The next stage is to dive into the spike costs. And something that we discovered as we worked through the data that was provided to us is that there were 4 main categories that we would say were core spike costs. And the first of those was additional staffing. It doesn't matter who you are or well-staffed you are, there's a very good chance that you will need to hire additional staff. Unless you've recently geared up with skills like social workers and caseworkers and really built up your capacity in that department, the chances are you're going to need to do some additional staff hires. So now remember that the baseline, even though it doesn't have how many staff you have, it's got your staffing figure. So all we want to do here is go, how many additional staff are you going to need to hire, or do you expect to hire as you move through your transition? Because this is going to be a core spike cost in your budget. Say you've already got 1 social worker, you've estimated that you're going to need 2 to carry the workload, then move the slider, and let's say we expect it to hire an additional 1. Community, many people going through transition, they're looking at those, how are we ramping up our community programs? That may involve hiring additional staff as well. And we know that the workload that falls onto support staff through a transition also increases. So if your centre is particularly understaffed, it may be that you need more hires all across the board. Then you're looking at what are the reasonable salary ranges that it's going to take to support those hires. And you can use the sliders to adjust this. So we've just assumed we consolidated everyone's data into US dollars. And so we ask that you need to do the same for yours, just to get that right comparison as well. So staff was the primary spike cost that we saw identified by the data surveys. The second ones were training and travel costs. So we asked people about a range of different activities that they might be involved in, whether that's family tracing or assessment or placement, monitoring children as part of casework. But when we asked them about what were the costs involved in those activities, number one cost was staffing, number two cost was training, number three was travel. So we've identified these as the next two cost drivers. The other thing that the data revealed is that these costs spike throughout the entire process of transition. Sorry to tell you that, but you do need to factor that in. So we've given you sliders that are available through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, as well as post-transition, so that you can factor the reasonable amounts into your budget. Travel, with visits to families and communities. If those families and communities are dispersed quite widely, you may need to really think about the travel budget and put some solid figures in there, because we know from experience that one can really balloon out. Again, easy slider feature allows you to adjust those through the different phases. Next, we move into case management. And as we asked our survey recipients, many of them referenced the salaries, training, and travel as the primary costs involved in case management. But most of them also referenced needing assistance at some point from external consultants and advisors. So if you're what we call taking care of your case management through in-house, through the staffing that you've hired for, then you can add in, or we would suggest adding in at least some nominal amounts towards some external advisors to supplement the team that you're building. We did have a couple of data recipients who, in lieu of hiring staff, they outsourced the majority of that process. So if you click that button, you'll see that immediately you need to be thinking in completely different ranges of costs. But remember, you're probably not investing into the travel and the staffing budget, because this is where it's going to sit. So as you think through how you're approaching your transition, you can play around with the figures. And again, this is documenting the assumptions that you're working forward. If something changes 6 months down the track, revisit the assumptions. How much of a difference is it really making? The fourth and final core spike cost is the aftercare programs. And 100% recipients were doing something in this space, as you would expect. Some of them called it vocational training, others family support packages, others stipends for families and children. It doesn't really matter what you called it, but there's a variety of responses that people may engage in this aftercare phase. And let's be realistic, at this stage of the transition, if you're at phase 1, then you probably have very little information about how you're going to handle that. But what you will know is probably these two core variables. How many children and how much would you like to be investing into this particular phase of aftercare? And so we've provided those variables for you. So if you're looking to make a significant investment into these families, because that's the nature of the families and the children you're working with, or if you're able to access a lot of external support, government support, other agencies, then you might be looking at more of a nominal amount. But again, you're looking forward. And if you can plan for it here, then you can budget for it. And if you can budget for it, then you can be asking donors and grant funders in advance, which is always a better time to ask for money rather than when you absolutely really need it. So I'll tell you from experience that these really are the 4 core spike costs that everyone needs, these categories of costs that you need to be thinking through and working through. We also gathered from our survey recipients a range of additional spike costs. At least everyone had one or two of these ticked. Some people had 3 or 4. There's a very good chance that you're going to have a couple of these yourself. So I would suggest working through the list, identifying what you need, playing around with the sliders. Good one to flag: legal dispute resolution costs. If you've got a property, who's going to want that property when things change? And if it's a significant amount of money, factor it in there. Therapeutic services, you're going to need therapeutic support, specialist support. It's not going to come from your staff. Factor it in there. I don't know how many times working with residential care facilities through transition that I've had to find $1,000-$2,000 to supplement the budget for some very important external services that were really life-changing for either the children and the families or the staff involved through vicarious trauma. So please don't underestimate. If you can factor it in now, you can budget for it. If you can budget for it, you can ask for it. Then we move on to step 4. This is the positive side of things. Start thinking about what's down the track. What does post-transition look like for you? If you like the organisations that I've worked alongside, their current annual baseline funding is always less than their current annual baseline budget. And so they'll always be behind the mark when it comes to having enough funds to cover spike costs as it is. If that's your case, factor it in there. You know your donor base better than I do. And if you think that they're going to come along this journey with you, if you think they're very invested into residential care, you might expect to see a drop-off in donors, or you might see that they get re-energized by relaunching programs that have a wider impact on the number of beneficiaries. The second component is simply to say, we've now come up with an amount of money that we expect to have post-transition based on these calculations. How would we be expecting to spend that on alternative activities? Now, if you tick the Pathway B button that you're closing down, this whole section will not be available to edit. But this gives you some baseline information on what it would look like if you were 50-50 involved in both family-based care and community-based services, and that you were able to have a greater impact on those beneficiaries. How many new beneficiaries would you be able to impact? What's that overall per beneficiary cost going to look like? This is very important information for boards and governing bodies to be processing along with their donor bases as they're looking ahead at what the future looks like for the organisation if it plans to continue to exist. And step 5, the final step, is to look at the results that have been generated through this journey. So you can see we've created a very simple 3-line graph. So we've got our baseline costs. And as I said, unfortunately, your baselines are more or less fixed. And so you're not really going to see that cost reduction until you hit the phase 3 50% reduction. Think about it, that's when you're going to start to be able to reduce those residential care facilities, reduce those fixed costs, adjust staffing, adjust building, adjust your overheads. And then because the organisations are continuing, chances are that some of those core costs, they don't disappear, they then get redirected into supporting the broader activities of the organisation. Then we've got our spike costs, which are rising through the duration as we move through the phases of transition. And then what we've done is in the post-transition phase, that's where we've gone. These are the redirected costs that are now available. And then we've got the black line, which is your overall budget. And so it spikes. As we move through transition, we see the spike in those costs, which means you need extra funding than perhaps you've already got available through your baseline cost funding. And I can tell you from experience, you want to be thinking about that here rather than when you're incurring those costs. So good time to get in grant applications and talk to your donors. Bad time to be talking to your donors unless you're begging. Then there's that opportunity to reduce the overall cost as you start to wind down before you ramp up into your post activities and restructure your funding. So we've got the grant, we've got the graph picture there mapped against the phases of transition information that you'll be accessing and reading along with as well. And for those of you who like some dollar figures, we've got the information there as well. And finally, you can submit your name and contact information, and you can email yourself a copy of that report. And that's the phases of transition tool. Back to you, Beck.
Thank you so much, Chad. That was fantastic. A really great overview, and hopefully everybody got a really good sense of what this tool can help you do and what it can help you consider as you are either going through a transition yourself, or if you are working with a partner and helping them to consider the different factors and implications for their costing around their transition.